Let me start by saying that Parasite is a movie full of delightful surprises. And while I don't intend on spoiling anything, it's an experience that's only enhanced the less you know going in. So, if Parasite has been on your radar and you have every intention of seeing it, maybe just go see it and turn this off. I'll just say this at the top. I think it's easily one of the best movies of the year, if not the best, so go check it out. And if Parasite hasn't been on your radar, or you want to learn a little bit more about it to be convinced to watch it, stay tuned and I'll do my best. In order to preserve the surprises of the movie, I'm going to talk in some very, very broad generalities about why I find it so surprising and so immensely satisfying. And let me start with a 2 or 3 minute crash course in 3-act structure. In the simplest terms, 3-act structure is just setup, conflict, and resolution. Most movies follow this format, if only because it's kind of the natural shape that movie-length stories take. Beginning, middle, end. Typically, the first and third acts run somewhere between 25 and 35 minutes, and the second act is usually quite a bit longer than the first and the third, sometimes twice as long. Obviously, not every movie does this, but I think the exceptions prove the rule. Not only is this the shape that stories 2-ish hours long naturally take, it's also what audiences have come to expect, consciously or unconsciously. We've been conditioned by 100 years of movies to expect our stories to come to us in this form, more or less. And I emphasize the word expect because I think it's helpful to think about structure in terms of audience expectation. Kind of the whole point of structure is just to organize the story in a way that the audience understands, so we know what's going on and where we're headed. Act 1 is setup. We learn about the characters, the world they live in, and what they want, as that's usually going to drive the rest of the story. Luke Skywalker wants to be a pilot and escape his dull life on Tatooine. Marty McFly wants to go away with his girlfriend for the weekend, but can't because his dad is generally hapless and unable to stand up to his boss. Woody wants to continue to be Andy's favorite toy and is threatened by the presence of a flashy new toy. Act 1 usually ends with a turning point of sorts, a point of no return. What I like to call the "and we're off" moment. That's when the setup is over and we're off on the adventure, whatever that may be. Luke decides to go with Obi-Wan to rescue Princess Leia and learn the ways of the Jedi. Marty accidentally travels back in time and has no way to get back to 1985. Woody knocks Buzz out the window and is then thrown out the window himself and must find a way to get back to Andy. Act 2 is the main conflict of the movie, the main journey. Whatever the movie is about in the general sense, that stuff usually happens in Act 2. If you're giving your friend the 30-second pitch for what happens in the movie, you're probably describing Act 2. Luke and Han rescue Princess Leia and join the rebellion against the Empire. Marty has to get back to 1985 without messing up the past, and now, oops, he has to get his parents to fall in love with each other. Woody and Buzz have to confront their own shortcomings and face their greatest fears to get back to Andy. Act 3 is usually one final challenge related to the main conflict, or like an extension of the main conflict after the main conflict's either resolved or nearly resolved. After rescuing Princess Leia, Luke and the rebels must destroy the Death Star. After getting his parents to fall in love, Marty must race to the lightning strike and get back to the future. After Woody and Buzz finally put aside their differences and become friends, Woody has to rescue Buzz from Sid and catch up to Andy's moving van. I bring all this up to point out that by the half-hour mark or so of a given movie, Act 1 should be wrapping up, and we should be about to get into the meat of the story. So the setup should be over, and we should have a good sense of how the next hour or so is going to go. We should be thinking, okay, I know where this is going. And by the time Act 3 rolls around, it shouldn't really come out of nowhere. It should ideally be a natural extension of what came before it. Just a final push for our characters' journeys. So, thank you for being patient. What does this all have to do with Parasite? Given what I just said about 3-act structure, I think, in general, it's hard for a movie to be surprising without being jarring. Like I said, by the end of Act 1, the audience should have a general sense of where things are headed for the main push of the story. And if things happen in Act 2 that completely turn the story on its head, sometimes that can feel like it's coming out of nowhere. And it can even feel like a betrayal of the promise of the Act 1 setup. Parasite has a couple of moments that turn the story on its head. And while they're certainly surprising, they're definitely not out of nowhere. And that's such an important distinction. surprising but not jarring. There are revelations in the movie that certainly change the trajectory of the story, but that new trajectory is still thematically related to the story that we thought we were in. So even though there's a hard left turn in the middle of Act 2, it never goes off the rails. It still feels completely in keeping with everything that came before. It's still the same theme, still exploring the same ideas, and really still telling the same story, just with a bonkers new escalation. It's an escalation you don't see coming, but also feel like you should have seen coming, given how perfectly it fits. And in fact, on rewatch, the first hour of the movie kind of makes the twists feel inevitable. It's seriously deft narrative sleight of hand by writer-director Bong Joon-ho, and it's hard to overstate how impressive it is. Same thing for the third act. My mouth was literally hanging open for probably 8 of the final 15 minutes, because it's very shocking at times. But again, you kind of kick yourself for being so shocked because it's also the logical place for the story to go. And on rewatch, you notice the setups that hide in plain sight that you didn't realize were setups. And so when shit hits the fan, you're like, yep, this makes perfect sense. It's shocking, but inevitable. And again, incredibly impressive sleight of hand and like nothing I've seen in a long time. So what actually happens in the movie? Parasite is about 2 families in Seoul, South Korea. The Kim family, who live in a basement apartment and struggle to make ends meet with minimum wage temp jobs, and the Park family, who are very well off and live in a fancy house designed by a fancy architect. Both families consist of a mother, a father, a son, and a daughter, and obviously they all have names, but I mostly just refer to them in my head as Mr. and Mrs. Park, Mr. and Mrs. Kim, the Kim's son, the Park's daughter, etc. The Kim's son, his name is Kiwoo. He has this friend who's preparing to study abroad, and he tells Kiwoo, hey, I've had this cushy gig teaching English to this high school girl, and the family's loaded and kind of dumb, so if you pose as a college student, you could probably take over that job. So Kiwoo does. He and his sister forge a diploma, and he cons his way into the Park household as a fake college student to tutor the Park's daughter. The polite but oblivious Mrs. Park mentions that her son is showing early promise as a painter, and the quick-thinking Kiwoo says, I know an art student who could tutor him. That's how the Kim's daughter also cons her way into working for the Parks, who have no idea that their son's art tutor and their daughter's English tutor are related. Eventually, the Kim parents also con their way into working for the Parks, so now the entire Kim family is involved in this ruse and must walk a tightrope to not be caught by the Parks. So it's an upstairs-downstairs movie, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a movie about class. Between Parasite and Us and Hustlers and Joker and Last Black Man in San Francisco, a lot of 2019 movies were about the distinction between the haves and the have-nots. An interesting thing that Parasite does is that there's not really an out-and-out bad guy. You know, the rich Park family are by no means evil people at all. You know, at worst they're a little elitist and oblivious, but they're not mustache-twirling villains. But let's unpack that a bit. The first half or so of Parasite is a comedy. The plot description I just described is a classic setup for comedy of errors. And comedies often lend themselves to broad, unlikable foils. But the Park family aren't exactly foils. Mr. and Mrs. Park just want what's best for their kids, so they buy them tutors and, they're polite enough. But another thing about Parasite is that it doesn't just stick to one genre. While the first half is a comedy, it eventually becomes more of like a thriller and even a bit of a horror movie, but it also kind of never stops being a comedy. There are more than a few moments where you're like really stressed out, but also laughing at the same time. Darkly laughing. I bring up the genre blend to note that the movie very subtly but very distinctly changes tone. The tone of the third act is quite a bit darker than the tone of the first act. And this change in tone colors the characters a little differently. Not giving anything away, but you'll know when you see it. There are a couple moments in the last act when the Park's privileged obliviousness is extremely grating. And it's not like the Parks changed at all. They're still the same nice enough, if not a little elitist people that they were in Act 1. It's just that by Act 3, the audience has seen some shit, and suddenly we want to get the guillotines out. And I'll say it a third time, that's some seriously impressive narrative sleight of hand. To the non-cinephile weirdos watching this, writer-director Bong Joon-ho isn't just some guy that came out of nowhere with this movie. He's a very well-respected and renowned South Korean filmmaker. Maybe the most renowned South Korean filmmaker, along with Park Chan-wook. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that this is the first Bong Joon-ho movie that I've seen. You know, Snowpiercer has been in my Netflix queue for literally 5 years now. I had every intention of watching Okja when Netflix released it 2 years ago, and I just never did. I Hear Memories of Murder and Mother are both amazing movies, and they've been on my radar for a bit. But, you know, excuses, Parasite is the first of his movies that I've watched. And even from a sample size of one, it's abundantly clear that Bong Joon-ho is a master of his craft. Parasite is some masterful filmmaking. It has a super smart script that director Bong co-wrote. It has interesting themes that only deepen with every story turn. It has genius production design, especially considering most of the story takes place in one house. And it's just straight up super entertaining. I probably should have led with that, but it's true. Parasite is extremely entertaining and extremely watchable. You know, I loved The Irishman, I loved Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I loved Marriage Story and all those, but Parasite is in the company of Knives Out as a 2019 movie that made me laugh, made me think, thrilled me, and forgive the cliche, was just a great time at the movies.